Hello and welcome to this seminar of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. My name is Martin Ruhs and I'm happy to chair this session. Today's topic is refugee protection and solidarity, the duties of EU member states. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Eleonora Milazzo, who is a joint research fellow at the European Policy Center and the Egmont Institute in Brussels. Eleonora works at the interface of academia and policy research in the area of migration and social inclusion. And she's the author of a recent book with Oxford University Press on refugee protection and solidarity, the duties of EU member states, the topic of today's discussion. And Eleonora holds a PhD from the EUI here, and she was a postdoctoral researcher at King's College London. So Eleonora, thank you very much for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Martin, and of course to you for the invitation and the opportunity to present my book here. Thanks to you all, both in the room and online, for attending this morning. And it goes without saying that it's a great pleasure for me to present the book here, as this is the sort of product of 4 years of PhD sort of work at the EUI. So thanks a lot for this opportunity, and looking forward to the discussion with you all. So as you can see from the title, the book is essentially a theory of what duties EU member states have towards each other in the field of refugee protection. And what I'm going to do during the next 20 minutes or so is to present 4 key points, 4 key arguments from the book. Here we go. Yes, so the first core claim that the book makes is that reforming the EU asylum system is a matter of distributive justice. And to do that, I look at 2 separate strands of scholarly literature. The first one looks at distributive justice in the EU, but not at the asylum system or at the issue of refugee protection, while the second strand of literature, the one on the ethics of migration, focuses extensively on states' duties towards asylum seekers and refugees, to some extent on duties among states, but with no specific discussion as to what happens or to what these duties might look like in the specific context of the EU. The second core argument that I develop in the book is that co-responsibility requires solidarity. So to put it very shortly, the fact that EU member states are co-responsible for several institutions, including an asylum system, requires that they also act in solidarity with each other. And I call this a duty to act in solidarity. The third key point of the book is to argue that engaging with non-compliers with this duty to act in solidarity is actually key. And so the second part of the book, which deals with the non-ideal theory, so to say, of solidarity in the EU asylum system, looks specifically at cases of non-compliance, how we should understand non-compliance with what I call a duty to act in solidarity. And then the fourth and concluding part of the book looks at the so-called quest for a democratic compass. So how to present normative theory of solidarity for the EU asylum system to the public, and make sure that, in addition to be strong in theoretical terms, it also wins public support. So let me look at each of these 4 key points from the book in turn. The first one, as I said, reforming the EU asylum system is a matter of distributive justice. And here the core sort of question of the book is precisely what duties do EU member states have towards each other in the field of refugee protection. There has been a lot of discussion back when I started working on this topic, but to this day on what EU states ought to do, not just with respect to asylum seekers and refugees, but also in their reciprocal relations. And so what I propose in response to this question is multi-layered ethics of asylum governance, which is essentially centered on two layers of reciprocal duties. The first layer, I argue in the book, is about general reciprocal duties of corporate cooperation that all states, as members of the international community, have towards each other in the specific field of refugee protection. These duties are universal in scope, and they are grounded in the legitimacy of states, as I said, of states as members in good standing of the international community. But then the book argues there is a second level of duties, which applies to EU member states in virtue of their membership in the EU, and this is an additional special duty, which I call a duty to act in solidarity, which this time is grounded in reciprocity and is associational in scope. And so to argue about and describe this duty, I draw on reciprocity-based internationalism as a theory of distributive justice in the EU, most famously elaborated by Andrea Sangiovanni. Then, in the next step, and coming to the second argument of the book, I describe what solidarity means. So, how we should understand the meaning and value of solidarity in this context. And here again, we keep hearing solidarity used in very different ways, and in relation to several, sometimes clashing understanding of reciprocal duties. So here the understanding of the concept of solidarity that I provide is one essentially institutional and normative, arguing that the fact that member states are co-responsible for the pursuit of their common good through shared supranational institutions, and also have a duty to protect asylum seekers, requires them to act in solidarity with each other. So solidarity in this sense, I explained, so it's solidarity as co-responsibility for the common good. And here then I sort of draw on the sort of prevalent understanding of solidarity as requiring a fair allocation of both the goods and the bads of corporate cooperation, in this case, cooperation for the provision of asylum in the EU, in the form of resource pooling and redistribution, which in this case are directed at morally required goal, which is the protection of refugees. And this should sort of prompt us to establish a permanent system to share both the financial and in-kind costs linked to refugee protection across all dimensions and stages of the reception, protection, and integration process. The goal of this system should be to bring all states above the threshold of decent and sustainable protection levels. This means that we should not aim for perfect equality, so to say, among EU states, but make sure that each one of them has enough to live up to their duties towards asylum seekers and refugees, but at the same time live up to their domestic obligations, so to say, to their citizens and residents. So here the shift that the book proposes is, first of all, to achieve some clarity as what the notion of solidarity or the sort of references to solidarity really requires, and also to bring this concept to bear on the way material costs are then distributed. And this, I argue, calls for a shift from a humanitarian logic for why member states ought to share responsibility for refugee protection to a more stringent one of core responsibility. At the same time, I underline that we are faced with the problem of assurance and the related challenge of non-compliance. So this is because while I explained that so different member states do have different obligations under the duty to act in solidarity, their geographical positioning is one of the sort of grounds on which they might have different obligations. And I can elaborate more on this during the Q&A. At the same time, their compliance with these obligations will depend to some extent on the willingness of other member states to collaborate in a fair scheme. So member states in this context, in the context of the asylum system, act as we call them contingent compliers. So they will act upon their obligations if they have reasonable expectations that other fellow member states will do the same. So what to do about this? The problem here is that the EU, at least on sort of paper, should provide for the ideal conditions for this assurance to be there, for various institutional reasons, and most of all for the fact that states are sort of locked in repeated games, we would call them, in drawing on game theory. And still we see that there's no such expectation of compliance of the others, expectation of the willingness to cooperate of other member states. So we are left with a problem here that prompt us to engage with how I call them non-compliers with the duty to act in solidarity. And so in a second part of the book, I look at the specific ways in which member states fail to fulfill their reciprocal duty to act in solidarity with each other. And I also ask in what way and how convincingly they justify their non-compliance. To do this, I look precisely at the way the content of the duty to act in solidarity is continuously renegotiated by EU states as duty bearers. And I propose the concept of responsibility shirking as the failure to fulfill the duty to act in solidarity as an imperfect duty or our responsibility. And to make sense of responsibility shirking between member states, I propose to use the concepts of justification and excuse from legal theory to assess policy responses. And here by justification, so legal theory offers us a sort of different understanding of what counts as a justification and what counts as an excuse. And so I explain how this can be an helpful and productive way to make sense of the various arguments that member states deployed or have deployed to justify why they do not act in solidarity, sharing responsibility for refugee protection. The goal of this exercise, and as you can see in the book, I also propose a sort of matrix with concrete cases or examples of different kinds of responsibility shirking. The goal is to understand whether all these cases of responsibility shirking, of failure of to act in solidarity, are equally reprehensible, and to understand whether we should reject them all, or whether there are some circumstances under which we are willing to discount the fact that member states fail to act as they should. So this is, in brief, I will not go into too much detail here, but this is the goal, to simply put, to sort of give a chance to critics of a very demanding view of solidarity in the EU to prove their arguments in a way. And the idea here is not simply to make a theory of solidarity in the EU asylum system more compelling, but also to engage with these views. And here comes the last key point of the book, which is precisely how to successfully bring a theory of solidarity that includes pre-distributive, distributive, and sanctioning mechanisms to win public support. And here the key point, I believe, that the key point that the book wants to make is that in addition to proposing which pre-distributive, distributive, or sanctioning mechanisms might work well, or might be more effective in bringing solidarity, in bringing about solidarity, we should also wonder how to win public support for such reforms. What we see here is that migration keeps being the object of a dilemma for policymakers, whereby we see that more policies lack a clear democratic mandate, while policies with higher levels of popularity do not serve the goals of justice. So how do we make sense of this dilemma when it comes to public support? And to this, we should also add an electoral puzzle, which is about the disconnect between citizens' preferences and the way these are translated into policy action. And here the work of the migration policy center on attitudes towards migration is particularly illustrative of what this electoral puzzle might be about. So beyond, so while the book is a book in political theory, normative political theory, so the key points that it wants to make is how solidarity should look like. At the same time, the conclusion that it comes to is that in addition to theorizing what solidarity should look like, we should also worry about its democratic legitimation and how to close the sort of electoral gap that makes it so that more solidaristic reforms do not win public support, or do not even get to the table, so to say. And I think this is the same sort of problem that we are seeing now with the latest steps in the negotiation of the asylum reform of the new pact on migration and asylum, which will have to come to a close in the spring of 2024. But we possibly see other challenges there when it comes to solidarity and responsibility sharing, public support for it, and in general, the discussion among member states on how our reform should look like based on political preferences as well. Yeah, so I will leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Eleonora, for a really interesting and very clear presentation. We've got about 40 minutes for questions and discussion, and I would like to encourage the people online to type their questions into the chat box on the right, and we'll make sure to take those questions. But I will begin with the people in the room. So if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
You use the microphone.
Thanks. I really like the presentation, and the book seems to be very interesting. So I was wondering how can you justify the first spatial obligations that you link with the duty to solidarity? Like, why exactly those four? Those are quite specific actions, like related to a certain outcome. Is there like any moral justification for picking exactly those four, or like those are just the most intuitive policy decision that you would like to have priority over other possible solutions? Thanks.
Shall I go ahead? Oh, okay, thank you very much for the question. I was trying to go back. So when you say the four obligations, you mean the redistributive you refer to this point, right? Or to the special obligations in general? You refer to four.
Sorry, can you use the mic, please? Because otherwise.
Sorry. The point in which you say that you derive from the duty to act in solidarity for obligation, and you number that 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, right. Yes.
And I wanted just to know how can you why just those four, or like?
Thank you for. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Yes, so yes. So when it comes to defining the obligations under their duty to act in solidarity, it is not just about this four. I guess the core of the argument there, and I elaborated a bit less on that part, but the core is really about resource pooling and redistribution. So this is the core of what solidarity requires. Then in order to achieve resource pooling and redistribution, and sort of looking at especially the geographical positioning of asylum seekers and the different part that they play in terms of their location, I think we also need to add something more to the way these obligations should be discharged. And this is where these 4 points come in. So this is more sort of responding to the empirical reality as we see it. So we see that it's a problem if, or at least we see, so based on duties towards asylum seekers, we know that states have a duty not to push back asylum seekers. So this is about the first one, really looking back at state duties not towards each other, but towards asylum seekers. And so they ought to register and identify them. And this is to avoid free riding on a system that allows for secondary movements. Again, based on geographical positioning, we also know that some states recurringly play the part of transit or destination states. And so we should add a specification when it comes to what duties they might have, in addition to pulling together their resources. And this is about keeping internal borders open. And then, of course, a fair reallocation system. So this is more a sort of in the non-ideal theory part of the book. This is more of a reality check where we sort of look at how things work as of now, and sort of I make some specifications of how the system should look like based on what we know about it today. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Lorenzo?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eleonora. I remember when you started working on this issue, was a very topical issue, and it still is today. So I'm sure a lot of people will read the book. I have maybe two questions. The first question on this point, I wonder whether maybe the case that your idea of solidarity is maybe too geared towards sharing material costs, and you end up in a situation where some countries, some communities really have to bear more operational costs, and the others just see this as a problem of sending material and in cash resources. And I guess one way out of this for you would also argue for a more fair reallocation of asylum seekers and refugees, as you write there, but we know in practice this is really not working. So whether maybe you have a way out of this, of also this that I see as a dilemma. And the second question maybe is a provocation. When I was listening to you talking about the first point that you make in your book about what you describe as a multi-layered ethics of asylum governance and responsibilities that different units within the system have, I was thinking maybe if we apply this also to the responsibility sharing within countries, whether you can think of other cases where communities might want to draw a red line. The Italian case, thinking of a very practical and recent example, with some regions, for example, saying that they're not going to comply with what the states issues in terms of what are called in Italy detention centers for people who have to be sent back to their countries of nationality, whether that would also be, in your view, a break of this multi-layered ethics of asylum governance, because you have some units of the system that say they're not going to comply with instructions that come from the higher federal unit in this case. Okay, I hope my questions are clear. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for the great questions. So regarding the first one, I fully share your concern that focusing too much on the material cost risk, sort of missing the mark when it comes to solidarity and responsibility sharing. And in fact, in the book, I would like to go back to the slide now, but I don't want the audience online to feel dizzy with the changing slides. But what I argue in the book is that the obligations descending from the duty to act in solidarity apply to all stages and dimension of the reception and protection of the protection process, broadly understood. So when I refer to the dimension of the protection process, indeed, it is not just about the material cost, but also the other in-kind cost, financial cost, cost in relation to capacity, and so on. So the three dimensions, I refer to the three sort of well-established dimensions of the protection system proposed by Gregor Knoll, which are about rules, people, and financial resources. So I believe the resource pooling and redistribution should happen across all three. And this is why, in general, this theory lends support for what we called mandatory flexible solidarity, provided that that all states meet minimum threshold in each of the dimensions. So I do not think that a system that allows member states to completely opt out of contributions in one of these dimensions and only contribute in one or two of them could work in practice and also bring about more solidarity among member states and justice for asylum seekers and refugees. I touch upon this a bit also. So this is what the argument sort of gets to, some sort of mandatory flexible solidarity, which I also elaborate a bit in another piece, which is a sort of spin-off, the book that focusing more on mandatory flexible solidarity. But this is sort of, so I fully share your concern and your view there. And then coming to the second point, yes, absolutely. What I think could be done with this multi-layered ethics is to both move upwards and in a way downwards governance levels, if you want. So we could, so the EU is a case of where there's an important role, important things to be said about supranational institutions and how they sort of matter for associational duties, but we could look at other regional organizations and still make a case for additional duties based on sort of membership in those organizations. And so moving downward, yes, so states, you mentioned a very good case of Italian regions. I think also municipalities could be a good case, because in some cases they have, in Italy, they have refused to accept the opening of reception centers on their territory. So in that case, again, not making their fair share, we could argue, or at least, you know. And so I think part of it would be, I think the model or the structure of the argument in those cases would be the same, but the idea is to also have a practice-dependent theory of solidarity, which is the sort of approach, the methodological approach that this book ascribes to or subscribes to. And so we would have to look at what the institution is exactly about, what the system is exactly about. So it would be nice to do that at some point.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thanks, Eleonora. So it's the second time I've heard you present the book, and I know I now need to read it because I keep asking questions which are probably covered in the book. So apologies if it's covered. But I was wondering if, in a sense, you could take your argument as saying, well, you could build support for the protection of refugees and not necessarily for asylum seekers. I'll explain what I mean by that. When you're talking about the justifications and excuses that states use, and I don't know the kind of theoretical background to that, one seemed to me to be missing, which is that asylum seekers are not real, they're not genuine. And that seems to have been the discourse for 30, 40 years, that people are actually entering the system who don't have a genuine claim for asylum, but they're using an asylum route. That has been such a dominant claim for so long. And in the presentation, you talk about asylum seekers, you also talk about refugees. And I'm wondering, you know, as I don't understand the distinction necessarily between justification and excuse, but it's certainly a discourse which has been dominant since the 1990s. I wonder how that then fits with your argument, because if you talk about public support, I could imagine public support for a system of refuge, people who are, you know, sort of perhaps through resettlement and things like that, rather than spontaneous asylum, which has been systematically delegitimized for 30 or 40 years now. And I think that the basis of public support for spontaneous asylum seeking has been really eroded. And so could that be an implication of your argument or reasoning? Might be an unfair question. But and a second thing, just very quickly, what to what extent can your argument also support kind of trading? Because it seems that the new pact on migration and asylum is essentially proposing kind of a trading system, but distributive justice can be achieved by countries trading with each other. We'll take responsibility if you pay us. And is there a normative threshold by which you would assess that kind of scheme? Can that be justified? So thanks.
Eleanor, if you don't mind to add one more question in interest of time, so we get the online audience as well as Stephanie.
Thanks. This is so interesting. Thank you so much. I was wondering if in your book or in your research, you looked at other examples of like, are there examples of normative responsibility sharing? Because I just always feel like it feels like responsibility shirking seems to be the norm. I've done a lot of research on responsibility sharing, specifically in resettlement, and it always feels a bit like there's one or two players that play right, and then a lot of ones who kind of like aren't pulling their weight. So I just was wondering if there are examples of how has it ever worked? I guess is my question. Are there examples that where it has worked in any context?
Thank you very much for the questions. So let me start with Andrew's question on spontaneous rivals. So I think, yes, no, there so I think there are two ways in which the issue of spontaneous arrivals come into the sort of picture in the book. The first one is to say that there's still a duty for frontline member states not to push back asylum seekers. So this is sort of the basic requirement, the basic duty that they have, not out of duties towards other states, but towards asylum seekers. And this is well established in international law, but also by the ethics of migration and refugee protection. So this is still sort of the red line that states cannot pass, and what happens next then can be discussed in terms of who should stay and how responsibility for those who are found somehow entitled to stay should be shared. Then that's a question for duties among states. So the first answer I think the book gives to this question is the question of spontaneous rivals when it comes to the duty of non-refoulement does not enter the picture of solidarity and responsibility sharing. But then in a way, obviously the pushback against this could be to say, yes, but it does matter how many people do arrive in the EU. That does matter for the way then responsibility sharing is organized and the related duty discharged, because obviously we might be talking about fewer or more people depending on how we draw the threshold. And I think here there is several arguments that I look at. One is I think a very strong one at the moment, which is that granting asylum in the EU is not the answer, that asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants should be helped closer to where they come from or in the place they come from. So this is a very strong argument that I treat in the framework of responsibility sharing as a justification. So as a pretty strong one that we should engage with. But I think it enters the picture of responsibility sharing once non-refoulement is satisfied in a way. Which again, I think is topical, because if member states decide to systematically act in solidarity with each other by making sure that less people can get to the EU, then the problem shifts, and we have to look at what what sort of just externalization or just external policies should look like. So this is for the first point. And then a trading system, yes, yes. So the in general, the arguments support trading systems, provided that there's so that all states meet minimum threshold, so that they all take minimum threshold of people in, and they also contribute financially or through in-kind contributions, provided that there is a minimum contribution. Then yes, a trading system can actually can sort of narrow the gap between, so can sort of lower the feasibility constraints and get us closer to the ideal. So yes, in short. So cases of responsibility sharing that do work. That's a good question. I hadn't thought about it. And I guess coming from, I guess, so having the EU in mind, I would say that there's, in general, I don't think I don't think we have examples of responsibility of successful responsibility sharing. I also think that in some cases, this is because of implementation problems, which I think is something that the current discussion on the asylum reform is trying to look at, improve implementation as well, in addition to policy making. So some issues with unsuccessful responsibility sharing might have to do with implementation more than policy making. But in general, I think that that we are still far from, you know, you were thinking about resettlement in particular as a more successful example? Or,
No,
okay.
not a more successful example, just same of like, there could be a normative framework, but it doesn't seem to be there. So I didn't know if as you kind of thought about it more theoretically, if there were examples you had seen where it seemed like, oh, this could be a model of how it has worked or could work.
Yes, that's a good question. My first answer would be no, but I will think more about it. Thank you.
All right, one more question in the room, and then we'll turn to the audience. Isabella.
I was wondering if you have any reflections about, I mean, from what I understood from your presentation, there is a focus on responsibility sharing, but what seems to emerge here is that there is also the notion of solidarity. So if you move away from discussing how to share responsibility and engage more on how to encourage solidarity, could be a solution to certain problems. And a very quick related question is, I mean, you have this notion of the challenge of non-compliance. Me as a lawyer, I'm thinking of it in very strict legalistic terms, but which we know don't work in the specific case. So how would you think, a couple of your thoughts to deal with those member states who do not accept not even minimum solidarity? So not even those forms of mandatory flexible solidarity that would allow them not to take people in.
Thank you. So on solidarity and responsibility sharing, Yes, so the idea is that essentially responsibility sharing is the content of a duty of solidarity, to put it very sort of to simplify there. So the two concepts are strongly interlinked. And I really refer and define solidarity in the book. So it is solidarity that I look at. And I think it's really interesting, as you were saying, so how could we sort of bring about a more solidaristic system? I think the conclusion that I came to is that in the EU, we have in many ways the ideal conditions for that more solidaristic system to actually come about. And the reason why we do not see such a solidaristic or more sort of normatively desirable system has to do a lot with the politicization of migration as an issue. So this is why I argued that in addition to proposing different responsibility sharing schemes, or even sort of clearing the ground as to what EU states' duties are in this field, like I tried to do, we should also worry about how to close that gap between policy making and the debate on migration. So for me, the last word is with how we actually frame and build narrative on migration. But this is coming from a political science perspective more than a legal one. So perhaps you will have a different view. And so what to do with states that do not accept even the minimum a minimum contribution. So I think what I propose in the book is that the last resort in this case could be to work on the basis of coalitions of the willing, which is in many ways could be seen as a second best. But I think is sort of ultimately what could work. So practically more feasible than sort of waiting for full and perfect compliance of all states, and also a way to somehow get closer to a normative ideal of solidarity. So work on the basis of coalitions rather than which can then act as attraction, so it can have an attractive force, as we know, as a matter of policy making and integration as well. So this would be my answer in short.
All right, thank you. I suggest we now turn to the questions from the online audience. There's a few questions in the chat on the right, and Eleonora, I suggest I'll just go over some of them. Maybe you can just take notes and then you can respond to whatever questions you want to respond to. So the first question is from Issa Tussar. What can be done to stop asylum-related systemic fundamental rights violations? And he also asks whether there's a silver bullet to the solidarity deficit. I think that's an issue you've discussed already. A second question from Julia Runte. Sorry, that's my German pronunciation of this name. Julia says, some EU countries will not allow a person to apply for asylum if they're in the country on a student visa, but the student was the only route possible to get there. And this then makes the person wait until their status changes. But then, as the person has been in country for some time, often asylum applications are rejected. So it's quite a specific scenario. And the question is, how can we work with this situation or streamline it to have solidarity with national laws? A third question from Lisa Nikolic. She asks about free riding. I think something an issue that you've discussed already. Asking about strategies for incentivizing countries to take in refugees, such as trade benefits, an issue that you've also discussed. Maybe you could comment on the third question. She asks, how can the EU better assist transit countries in managing refugees before they enter the destination countries? And then we've got two more questions. One on the role that policy can play to encourage resilience among refugees and internally displaced people, and one day potentially support their return. And another question about integration, again from Mr. Dosar: how can policy help refugees integrate into host communities, and what are likely consequences? So apologies, I haven't read out all the comments in full detail, but I think these are some of the main questions. So I suggest you take whatever time we've left, 10 minutes, to respond to some of these questions.
Thank you to all of you joining us online. I think it's really interesting that so many of these questions do not focus necessarily on relations among states, but on the duties that these states have towards asylum seekers, which is, I think, and refugees, which, as I said, I do believe set the scene for any discussion on duties among states. So a couple of you referred to systemic violations of asylum seekers' rights or migrant rights, but also unjust rules. I noted down. And in general, the role of policy that the policy can play to encourage resilience, integration, but also support return. So I think all these points are not part of the book, as I said, which focuses pretty strongly on duties among states, but they do set the scene for how we should think about duties among states. And I think it's all the more important to take this into account as we see that actually states are increasingly, and I refer to EU member states, are increasingly more focused on restricting the space for protection of refugees and migrants' rights in the EU, and to also discourage their rival in the EU, to say the least. So I think the question that we could ask from the point of view of what the book says is whether what we are seeing now is not so much solidarity in relation to making the asylum system more so to say just towards asylum seekers and refugees, whatever their status might be, but to direct interstate solidarity towards excluding them, or towards building a much more exclusive system. And so the question there, I think, should be whether this is solidarity, whether we should regard that as solidarity among states, whether this is indeed empirically or descriptively, solidarity, but not normative, sort of normative notion of solidarity as a duty, which I think is the case. So to respond to all this question, I think in many cases, the way the debates on solidarity among states and justice towards migrants interlink is precisely to say solidarity among states is now increasingly directed at restricting access to the EU and also to limiting the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, which I think is a problematic use or reference to the concept of solidarity, that in this case cannot be a duty, but simply a descriptive term. And then coming to the question on transit countries. So how can the EU better assist transit countries? I think, again, this is, so I think we are seeing a lot of this at the moment. We know that cooperation with third countries is now somehow on the top of the EU's agenda, is shared as a priority both by the Commission and the Council. So I think that more than assisting transit countries, the question is really in what terms the EU cooperates with these countries to manage movements or inflows towards the EU. And I think this raises several questions, as whether this is simply a way to externalize responsibility for these people, what human rights guarantees should be put to ensure that cooperation with third countries is not only in the EU's interest of limiting or reducing the number of migrants arriving to the EU, but also safeguards the basic rights of these people. And as I said here, again, solidarity is at play, because we hear this concept also in the context of saying we need a European response in the form of reducing the number of people arriving to the EU in cooperation with third countries, with problematic implications for the respect of the rights of migrants. So here, I think another question for the meaning and value of solidarity.
All right, fantastic. Unless there are any other more questions, I suggest we bring this to a close. Well, first of all, let me thank Eleonora for a really great presentation and an excellent discussion. Thank you, everybody, for asking the questions. And can I just remind everybody to take a look at Eleonora's book on refugee protection, solidarity, the duties of EU member states, published with Oxford University Press earlier this year. And please also keep an eye out for forthcoming seminars of the Migration Policy Center. Have a nice day and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.